Thank you all, and I want to first say thank you so much to Ken for introducing me, to Christine Strom for the invitation, and to Annalisa Verhoeven for putting together this exhibition on modern (ism). I'd like to thank the Weissman Art Museum, also in Minneapolis, for donating several of the works, including 2 of the Kthe Kollwitz prints on display, the first and the third one. And I'd also like to say thank you so much for coming. And this is kind of like my debutante ball as a new professor at UMD, and I'm just so, oh, now it's really loud. So I'm just so happy to be here and to be able to work with actual objects is just a total thrill. And Kthe Kollwitz, as Ken was saying, is really an artist who resonates with our time. Many, many decades later, you'll see that she's sort of a sad figure, but an honest one. So I'm just so thrilled to be here and to see you all here, and thank you very much. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions at the end. So Kthe Kollwitz lived from 1867 to 1945. This photo is from around 1930. She was a leading printmaker of her time. One of the very first women in Germany to receive accolades equal to those that men received, including being elected to the Prussian Academy of Art. Kthe Kollwitz was an activist who took a special interest in the plights of the working class, and eventually a lot of her work centered on women and children and the experience of war and grief that impacted women and children in particular. And in fact, her work, what I think is most interesting about it is that it offers insights into the progressive ethos of the time, as well as the sort of loss of possibility, political possibility in Germany as fascism swelled. And more significantly, and this is a major point, pivot point of my talk today, is that Kollwitz renovates common definitions of modernism, this sort of idea of art for art's sake. That to be modern is to be touched by a mysterious form of genius that's independent of current events or politics. And because Kollwitz's modernism is wholly rooted to her activism, to using art as a means of advancing representation, of memorializing atrocity, of representing the underrepresented, and ultimately of working through the disappointment she felt and experienced very deeply in the modern world. So what I wish to argue today is that to be modern is to be concerned with a multiplicity of things, of form and technique. She was a master printmaker, but also of subject and politics. So these are the 3 prints that are in the exhibit, and when I first conceived of this, I thought, oh, well, I'll go into the gallery, but I just don't think that's going to happen. So I would very much like if afterward some of us go and check out these works together, but I can give you a size based on my hands right now. So the middle one is the smallest, the self-portrait. It's about the size of a palm. The working class woman with the earring is the middle, is the second largest. It's about 1.5 feet high. And Conversation with Death is the largest, maybe the biggest, most impactful messaging as well. So when you're going to look at the work, if you haven't already done so, I want you to also think about how these pieces interact with the other works of modern, quote, ism on display. So how does this work interact with your own conceptions of modern work, and how does it differ? We'll get on to some of those as well in the talk. So I'll give you a little biographical information because Kthe Kollwitz really was a progressive feminist leader of her time. She was born Käthe Schmidt in 1867 in then East Prussia, which is today Poland. She grew up in a political family, so like a lot of women who advanced as artists before it was, a little more possible, she had a lot of support from her father and also her uncle. Her father and uncle were actually founding members of the Socialist Democratic Party, which is still one of Germany's 2 most important political parties, the SPD. Kollwitz initially trained as a painter, but she turned to printmaking because she realized that the opportunities for women in painting were pretty limited. And not only that she was being compared always with the value and possibilities that men could achieve, she turned to printmaking because she saw it as a medium that she could use to reach mass audiences. So the duplication, the multiplicity, this is a very modern way of using art as a means of reaching mass publics deliberately, of, again, representing plights of the underrepresented and bringing those representations to the people she's actually representing. In 1891, she married a physician, Kthe Kollwitz, and in fact, her father sent her off to Munich for a year to study at an art academy because he said, Käthe, you have a great talent. I don't want you to just forget about this. You have to go and sort of, figure out what your passion is and make sure that this doctor isn't going to just tell you, oh, leave your art at the door, which he didn't do. He was a doctor who set up his practice in Prenzlauer Berg, which is a working class neighborhood traditionally of East Berlin. Today it's the place you go if you want like organic bananas and mate lattes and nice things. So Karl was a physician for the Workers' Health Insurance Fund who often treated the working poor for free. So they really had this communal relationship talking about the plights of the poor. And Kollwitz set up her studio in his hospital, in his office. And she frequently depicted the working class that he treated in her prints, as in this work, which is on display in this exhibition, working class women with the earring. And her interest in representing workers, and especially women, would evolve from an early interest in narrating workers' histories. And what you'll see also through the evolution is she doesn't have a sentimental relationship to representing the working class. There's a hardened quality to the images. There's a seriousness. This woman is clearly, she's made a little more humanized by the earring, but she's still very, has something really important on her mind. And that's a face that you see pretty regularly in her work. So I wanted to give you a little sense of her scope of where she starts from these historical kind of narrative works to later works that are representing ineffable feelings. Kollwitz gained her notoriety from this series, the Weaver's Revolt, that she printed from 1893 to 1897. It's 6 prints based on the 1844 strike of weavers. And again, you see this unsentimental, really frank imagery of the poor, but more specifically, we have a narrative going on. So the first print is called Need, and it shows the quiet despair of a mother bending over her sick child, which really is already bearing the marks of death. The 2 introductory prints depict a general way of life, of the circumstances of the weavers, what drew them to rebel. And then subsequent images narrate the story of the uprising, including the ultimate suppression by the military. So this is not a narrative that ends very well, but it was nonetheless something she wanted to put and make permanent on the visual record of Germany. So for example, March of the Weavers is the penultimate image, and we see a really active force happening, working together, whereas before things were a little more atomized in the images. Now, as I said, Kollwitz became really famous from this series because it was exhibited in 1898 in a major exhibition, and she was given a gold medal that the Kaiser refused to bestow upon her because he thought the work was too controversial, too political, too incendiary. Nevertheless, her peers honored her with this professorship at the Berlin Art School, where she taught printmaking and figure drawing. So there's a lot of times, as we all know, the conflict between the powers that be and the artists themselves. And Kollwitz is really representing what artists themselves believed art could do, what they wanted to see represented. Now her next series, again a really narrative series, is called Peasants' War. She would continue working in cycles throughout her career, always representing the oppressed and disempowered. So the Peasants' War series of 7 prints is based on a history, an important history from 1525 to 26 of a peasants' revolt. And again, specifically, this brutal treatment that the peasants ultimately began with and then ultimately faced because of their willingness to get together and try and fight the powers that be. So the first image in the series begins with depictions of toil and the labor of the body. Subsequent images show a little more, power, empowerment. And in these works, we start to see a development in the way that Kollwitz represents women specifically. So no longer are they bystanders, but they're actually the activators, the source, the provocateurs of revolt, as we see pretty clearly in Outbreak. And again, there's this series, just like Weber's Revolt, really ends in a sadness, and it culminates in After the Battle. In this print of the aftermath of battle, an aged and hunched over mother, you can hardly see this, it's actually a very dark print, but the projector is making it even darker, is touching and illuminating her fallen son with a lantern on a darkened field that's strewn with anonymous corpses. Now, the Peasants' War failed because, just like the Weber's Revolt, the aristocracy slaughtered a third of the fighters. So 100,000 people died, and the survivors were fined, and few of any goals were achieved. Now, again, like I said, Kthe Kollwitz is not somebody that makes you feel really happy about the world, but she is somebody who represents realities that at the time people weren't really talking about or weren't representing visually. And again, this working class woman with the earring is sort of, we can think of this also as a sketch for some of those series that are a little more detailed stories. This lithograph on display, the one that's about the palm-sized in the exhibition, shows Kthe Kollwitz's move toward a style of imaging working class women in a more austere manner that we saw in Working Class Women with an Earring. And Kollwitz made a number of self-portraits throughout her career. She was recording her anxieties as a mother and as a witness to 2 world wars eventually, and as a witness to the failure of the socialist revolution that she was a really core part of. And again, we can interpret her self-portraits as sketches for studies for facial expressions, but also the autobiographical aspect becomes increasingly important in Kthe Kollwitz's work. You can't really divorce her own expression of grief from her work ultimately. Many self-portraits were made before, during, and between the 2 world wars, and this is one of the most famous of them, so I brought it in to give you a sense of comparison. This lithograph its etching is a little more soft, and this is a little harder. In 1919, Kollwitz began work on war. Her response to the tragedies endured during what she called the unspeakably difficult years of World War I and its aftermath. There are 7 woodcuts in the portfolio that focus specifically on the experience of women, widows, and children. And in these works, we start to see her no longer having a narrative to her prints, but really trying to get at an ineffable experience of grief, trying to represent grieving through these 7 images. In The Sacrifice, for example, the first one that begins the series, we see a new mother offering up her infant as a sacrifice to the cause. And this is actually autobiographical because Kollwitz herself had encouraged her youngest son to enlist in the war in World War I, and he was killed in action 2 weeks later. And her work she never actually recovers from that grief, from that sense of guilt, and this is all of her works that occur after 1914 are really punctuated by that sadness and grief, which makes this sad face, for me anyway, have a lot more meaning and specificity. So she was no longer simply watching the loss of power in the hands of the working class, but she was seeing the real impact of war, and a war that she, like I said, had encouraged her son to join. Volunteers is the only print that she would include that shows combatants, and in it, her son Peter takes his place next to Death, so he's on the far left with the drummer, the Death drummer, and he's leading a band of young men into war. Now, finally, we have an image like the mother's, where she's showing this need for women and mothers to come together to experience grief together. And these images are really didactic, and they kind of fly in the face of modernism's enigmatic content, this overdetermined content in modernism, where we can all have our own experience, we can have our own interpretation. For Kollwitz, no, it's really explicit. This is about the atrocities of war, the impossibility of overcoming the grief of the loss of a son, and the fact that she is so emphatic about visualizing this is her way of punctuating how important it is for us to think about. And again, that's an important part of modernism. And her prints were exhibited in 1924 at the newly founded International Anti-War Museum in Berlin. Around this time, we start seeing her using these hard lines of the woodcut in even more explicitly activist work, like posters. So she isn't just making prints to put in exhibitions, but she's actually making posters that are going to support the pacifist movement, support efforts to give women and children food. And this poster I thought was pretty interesting to look at, because the impact of her visual work and its explicitness was also vulnerable to manipulation, because this print, Bread, which people actually use a great deal, was appropriated by the Nazis, who reprinted this, claiming that the images showed the victims of communism, and reproducing Bread without asking her, or without crediting her at all, and using a fake signature. And it's particularly contradictory, because then Kollwitz was included in that really famous degenerate art show where modern artists were meant to be, thrown out with the bathwater. So to bring back this kind of ethos of artists, German artists, confronting war, thinking about war, making prints specifically to distribute an idea of an opposition to war, an opposition to a rise of fascism, capitalism. I'm bringing in a piece by Otto Dix, Woman with a Feather Hat, which doesn't actually look explicitly anti-war, but I'll show you in a moment, or right now, I should say, what he was doing around this time. So Otto Dix also made a war series, and this is really similar to Kollwitz's war series of the same time, except that he himself was in the war, and he's trying to depict his own experiences of war, this mechanized warfare, the first time in history that war had been made anonymous. This stormtroopers advancing under gas. Your enemy is suddenly an alien, a non-human subject. And what's really interesting, again, remembering that Kollwitz asked her son to enlist, and Dix, like many German artists at this time, or prior to World War I, had wanted to join the war, believed that the war would kind of make a tabula rasa, like a brand new beginning for Germany. And ultimately, they realized that war was not going to function to generate revolution. So this brings me back then to Woman with a Feather Hat, which is, as I said, also in the exhibition. So in this piece that sort of looks like maybe a piece of fashion, he is making a critique of the growing capitalism and consumer culture in Germany. Making this woman who has clearly no interest in her viewer, clearly no interest in anything but her feather hat is the implication, and he is critiquing kind of subtly the status quo of the time. This work is also on loan from the Weissman. So this brings us then to the third and final piece by Kollwitz that is included in this exhibition. This lithograph, Conversations with Death, 1923, the largest piece on display. Kollwitz began her conceptual work on the Death series in 1922, which I'll show you in a moment. And this is a study for that series. We can understand it. 10 years before she completed that portfolio, which would be her last major work, Kollwitz noted in her diary, "I must do the prints on death. Must, must, must." She chose lithography, her preferred technique for creating an emotionally powerful image with universal resonance as the medium, but she struggled to shape her ideas and only executed the first prints in 1934. So Conversations with Death is kind of a first attempt to be starting to think through what would then preoccupy her for the next 20 years, this relation to death, this inability to escape a looming, the grief that she was experiencing from her son's death. What I think is particularly important, though, about this work is that at the very same time, she's still making very activist, kind of hopeful prints. So she's making Never Again War, for example, is a pretty well-known distributed print of Kollwitz's. And so she hasn't quite lost this battle to think, the socialist battle, this belief that maybe something is going to turn, maybe life is going to be better. But again, it's a sort of vast, toggle between these two. At the same time that she's a very active person in the political campaigns, she's also just plagued with what would become a reality for her, that nothing was going to get any better. So her last great work is the Death series. And this was really inspired by the experience of her son's loss in World War I. This is the final image in the series, and this is a self-portrait. In the same way, we can understand this piece in the exhibition to be a self-portrait. Again, a woman is entrusting herself, but her children also to death. Kollwitz is not able to protect her children anymore. She is not able to protect any future anymore. She's really lost all confidence in political possibility in Germany. Of course, the rise of fascism would have made that particularly a difficult way of changing a person's perspective. The Call of Death is another kind of self-portrait that she made. This is the last in the series on death. And it really, again, just this all-consuming, these sad, sad images that she just cannot stop making in the late 30s. She died on April 22nd, 1945, so just a few weeks before the Nazis capitulated. So she never saw any new hope for Germany, and probably didn't believe that it could be possible anymore. So let's get back to then bigger issues, this issue of what is modern, what is modernism? What defines modernism? I'm sure all of us have a different definition. And Kollwitz really reminds us that modernism is about a politics of representation. Kollwitz's attention to the plight of the poor was in conversation with modernists of a generation before her. So people, for example, the French realists who were beginning to paint prostitution in France and saying, this is a part of our culture and we need to pay attention to the experiences of these working women because we're just contradicting ourselves to think that the growth of cities and the growth of culture is just this perfect, beautiful enterprise. So it was exceedingly modern for Kollwitz to continue with that path, to continue to focus her attentions on the less fortunate. Kollwitz's expansion of this subject over time from the experience of the working class to a specific attention to women and mothers, and then to the aftermath of war, is a further enhancement of making a commitment to making manifest, that is to say, to making a recording of a reality, to making it permanent in the arts. Her use of the medium of print and her stated intention of using print as a way to distribute her message across multiple platforms defined an intelligent union of politics and creative culture. So her work is both high art and visual culture. Now let's put her briefly in conversation with a few of the other people that are in this exhibition. The radicality of her work becomes particularly poignant when we compare her with other modernists in the exhibition, people who are more household names, like Salvador Dali. Salvador Dali being a person who really falls into the generic, more comfortable definition of modernism, art for art's sake, the artist as a kind of mad genius. In Dali's portrait of Cervantes, we see a really beautiful exploration of technique and line. This is something Kollwitz did too. She was a master printmaker. She was very interested in the representation, in the craft of making itself, which is another important aspect of modernism. And in this series, just to give you a little background, Salvador Dali was commissioned to make important prints of important figures from Spanish literature. Now we also have Lincoln and Dali Vision, a painting from 1985. And this is a perfect representation of the amusing, the ahistorical, the idiosyncratic of modernism. Because what is Dali Vision and why does it matter to Abraham Lincoln? Well, it doesn't matter at all. It's just Dali's weird thoughts, right? And that's fine, right? That is an important aspect of modernism, is the individual wanting to express him or herself. And it's and actually this piece is if anybody's been to the Cervantes or the Dali Museum in Figueres, this piece is made really large and is an installation in that museum. So it's a pretty important aspect for him anyway. And it's fun to look at because it embodies modernism's ineffable, undetermined vision. We make what we want to make of it. But we have to recall that Dali was ultimately in cahoots with Spanish era fascism and received great benefits from Franco, from the dictator. So obviously a very different kind of modernist than Kthe Kollwitz. Less incendiary is somebody like Pablo Picasso, whose simple and confident line work are masterful, but nevertheless, could be critiqued as being similarly myopic in the way Dali's work is not really thinking about something beyond his own genius. But then again, that myopia, this sort of the fact that you can look at these two pieces which are in the exhibition and just enjoy them, just take pleasure in this confidence that Picasso has that is just unmatched, is a really important pleasure of modernism. And there's these simultaneous divergent schools of artwork, people working in various modes. And we can't forget, of course, that Pablo Picasso would make one of the most important anti-war statements in his piece, Guernica, in 1938. And for those not familiar, this is a mural-sized painting that depicts the firebombing of a town in the north of Spain by the Nazis. And he made it in a matter of something like 3 weeks. And it's so important as a message of anti-war that it hangs in the United Nations. I mean, a copy of it hangs in the United Nations. And in fact, many of you will remember that when the Iraq War was proclaimed, they covered it up because it's that significant of a message of anti-war. But Kollwitz, unlike Picasso, could not separate herself from what she was witnessing. She was a person who only worked from the surface, from her experience. So I conclude then, once again, with this, what I think is the most haunting of the three images from Kollwitz in the exhibition, which is also the most personal. from my perspective, because we see this is like a memento mori, representing an obsession but also an inescapable depression that haunted her to her death. She could have escaped into beautiful line work as Picasso did, or Dali, but she didn't, she couldn't. Her life had seen too much. So Kollwitz offers us no positive outcomes for women, work, and war, but rather a sorrowful certainty of a reality that was and would remain ruthless in her time, and obviously became increasingly worse throughout her lifetime. So let these images become our most important totems of modernism. If this exhibition is asking us, what do we define as modernism? A period that advanced the politics of representation in art, that united realism with high culture. Let us allow our escapes into the lush whimsies of culture, of course, but know that these are diversions and not truths. To do otherwise would be to neglect the plight of Kollwitz and her fellow witnesses to the irreality of a world unraveled by war, consumerism, and fascism. So thank you very much.